Speaker, the Leader of the House made an effort to be statesmanlike. It lasted 1.5 minutes. And then he got into a range of descriptions of film shows and who should be starring it. And, of course, the member himself is the self-proclaimed star of Free Willy. There's a sequel to that about Whale Rider that I won't go into in this House. Mr. Speaker... Mr. Speaker, we are now 2 years into the term of this Parliament, 2 years into the term of this national government, and it's time that the national government took responsibility for what is happening in this country, Mr. Speaker. You know, we had a tax switch this year. This is the year of the tax switch. And Bill English stood up and said that that would turbocharge the New Zealand economy. Turbocharge the New Zealand economy. Well, Fran O'Sullivan writes for the Herald, and she's known to be a supporter of the government, and she reflected on this. Turbocharge, she said, actually more of a fizzer. This is a tax switch that didn't work, Mr. Speaker. This was a tax swindle because we were told that this was going to compensate New Zealanders and they would be better off. Of course, you couldn't believe that. You couldn't believe that because this was the same government that said very sincerely in the Bill Clinton-type way, National will not be increasing GST. Yeah. And they didn't have relationships with anyone on that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the truth of the matter is that this is a government that is governed for the privileged. Governed for the privileged. That's why 42% of the tax cuts went to the top 10%. And what about the people that I will acknowledge soon, the people like the cleaners in this building? What did they get? The bottom 20%, they got just 2% of the tax cuts. And you know the real disgrace about that tax switch? And it came out in the half-yearly economic and fiscal update. The tax rewards for the wealthy were paid for by borrowing. Paid for by borrowing. You know, this government will borrow, according to Treasury figures, $3 billion to reward the people that get the highest incomes. You know, 650 millionaires in this country, what did they get? They got over $1,000 a week extra in the hand. But ask the constituents in Wainuiomata or in Miramar or in Mount Roskill, the people on the median wage, what did they get? They got $5 a week. $5 a week as against $1,000 a week, Mr. Speaker. It is a disgrace. This government must bear responsibility for the figures released by the Treasury this week. The blowout in the deficit of $2.5 billion. You know, John Key at the start of this year, not even the start, it was May, 6 months ago, he said we had the deficit at the maximum level we could take it to. And 6 months later, it's $2.5 billion more. And who is responsible for that? The national government. You know, John Key got up in the House today and he said it's the global economic crisis. You know something, Mr. Speaker? You've been a trade minister, I've been a trade minister. This country is earning more than it's ever earned before because it's got the highest terms of trade ever. The money is flooding into this country, but it isn't going into the pockets of the average New Zealander. The person that's now paying $2 a litre for their petrol, the person that's paying 22% more to rent their house in Auckland than they were last year, the person whose rates are going up, the person who's paying 12% more for their fresh fruit and vegetables than they were this time last year. And this government says that it's against taking the GST off fruit and vegetables. Jerry Brownlee should know more than most. This is a country where we've got 1 child in 4 that is already obese by the time they enter school. The third highest obesity rate in the country, and the least we could do was give families the chance to be able to afford decent food for their kids, Mr. Speaker. But I want to talk a bit about employment too, because this year ends on a sad note for a lot of New Zealanders. 150,000 New Zealanders out of work. And I ask the members across the other side of the House, which ones of you feel proud about the fact that nearly 50% of our Pacific and Maori teenage girls are out of work and not in education and training? Who feels proud about that? More than a third of our teenage Maori and Pacific boys out of work. And I say to this government, after 2 years, when the unemployment is 3 times what they inherited from this country, that is a disgrace. You are not doing your job on that side of the House. The financial management of this country has been a disaster. I asked Jerry Brownlee, why is it that the Australians have created 350,000 new jobs this year? 350,000 new jobs, 54,000 in November alone. And I asked Mr Brownlee why it is that all his government has come up with is gimmicks. Cycleways. How many jobs from the cycleways? Was it 200? Was it 200? Did it get that high? 200. Mr Speaker, you know, when we talk about figures and unemployment, we're not talking about statistics. In that supermarket in my electorate that opened this year, 150 new jobs, and I welcome that. 2,700 people in my area lined up to apply for them. Not highly paid jobs, 2,700, and they ask me why it is that Paula Bennett blames them for being unemployed when there are not enough jobs to go around. Not enough jobs to go around. Mr Speaker, this government has failed. It's failed on its own measures. It said it was going to close the income gap with Australia. Remember that? That was the promise before the election. What has happened since the election? That gap has grown by 37%. That is a mark of the failure of this government. The wage gap between New Zealand and Australia has grown by 37%. Which members of the national government and their coalition partners are proud of that achievement? Mr Speaker, that is absolutely appalling. There is no plan to build our economy into a stronger economy. There is a plan, however, to make cuts. Why is it that the Herald day after day runs cases of people who have suffered accidents and are now told that under Nick Smith, ACC regards an accident as resulting in a degenerative disease? A degenerative disease. Why is it that the number of people challenging the ACC the decisions have trebled and many of them are winning? Because this government is surreptitiously cutting. Not so surreptitiously for our kids. Our kids at early childhood education, $400 million cut, fewer kids that will progress, fewer kids that will be successful in their education and be able to make the most of their lives. That's something else for the National Party to be proud of. Mr Speaker, I want to acknowledge the 2 tragedies that have affected New Zealand. First of all, the Christchurch earthquake, and I've spent many days in Christchurch, and I acknowledge the work that Jerry Brownlee has done, as I acknowledge the work that all of my colleagues have done, and Jim Anderton, working to help people whose lives have been disrupted and who have suffered through that earthquake. And I just hope, Mr Speaker and Mr Brownlee, that now that the television cameras have gone, that the promises that were made, apparently so sincerely, will be upheld in the years to come. I hope that that is the case. Mr Speaker, the miracle of that Christchurch earthquake was that no one was killed. But tragically, across the Alps, 29 miners lost their lives at Pike River. And I think everyone was sincere when they offered their support and their sympathy to the bereaved who had lost their husbands, their sons, and their brothers. And Mr Speaker, I want to say this absolutely sincerely. If there is any way in which we can recover the remains of those whose lives have been lost, then we have an obligation as a country, as a community and as a government to actually retrieve those remains. Cost should not be a problem. The promise was made that those, their sons and their brothers and their husbands, would be bought out if that is humanly possible. And I hope that the government honours that commitment, because if they do, they will have the support of this side of the House and they'll have the support